Vehicle, the seats look like they've come out of a 1960s aeroplane. They've even got little ashtrays stuck in the side arms, so you're quite comfortable if you happen to be the commander in the back of this one.
If you remember events in Tiananmen Square, that was where the APC was first seen. Much lower vehicle, of course, but basically the same type of chassis and the same engine and driver layout, but with a smaller body than the commander. It's quite an interesting vehicle, all the same, an indigenous Chinese design. It's quite unusual in itself. The Chinese invariably copied the Soviets, but not with this. Inside it's got a load of radio sets, and the aerials are still attached to the back of the hull, and it's a very clever little vehicle in many ways, quite compact compared with other armoured command vehicles, as we'll show you later. But at least to give you some idea of what the interiors of these things were like. And certainly the people who sat, as David said, on the seats in the centre were rather like the commanders on a throne. You had a lovely little ashtray in the armrest, and they were all beautifully padded. So whoever was in there was travelling in supreme comfort, or relatively speaking, supreme comfort anyway.
This particular vehicle was supplied to Iraq in 1983, and it was subsequently captured in the First Gulf War, and a number of vehicles came to the museum after the First Gulf War. They were brought back because it was about the first time in the, certainly for the British Army, we got a large number of Chinese and Soviet designed vehicles that could be brought back for testing. And one of the roles these vehicles have is not just for recognition, not just measuring the size of the armour plate, etc., but they were taken on exercises on Salisbury Plain where all the radios were turned on, the engines were turned on, so they could look through things like thermal imaging, they could work out what they call the heat signature, radio signatures from the vehicles. So there's so many modern ways of looking at the enemy that when you can identify just from a heat signature what the type of vehicle is, means you may not have to see it at all with the naked eye. So vehicles like this were actually used to help the modern army develop its counter forces. What's the best way of detecting and finding out about these vehicles? And this vehicle coming on now, this is another that was actually captured in that First Gulf War. This one's something called an ACRV, or Armoured Command and Reconnaissance Vehicle.
You'll find it's got a crew, maybe of 3 or 4 to drive it and man it normally, but it also carries extra staff inside whose job it is to command the battery, in fact, and sort it out for firing. The problem with it is that the length of track in contact with the ground for the width of the vehicle is far greater than is deemed normal for a tracked vehicle. Normally, if you're putting very wide or very long tracks on, you want a good distance between them. But in this case, it's not really wide enough, and it makes the vehicle difficult to steer. It's got a suspension of torsion bars, and the road wheels are very similar to those on the PT-76 amphibious tank. But it's really quite an unusual vehicle, very big, and quite a sight to see when it's storming around the arena.
This would accompany artillery units going forward, not obviously in the front line, but just behind the front line. And the artillery was something called a 2S1. It was a similar vehicle, slightly shorter, but with a turret and a larger artillery piece on the top. And so, again, Soviet system, keep all the vehicles in a similar type and similar speed as well for the advance. And this particular one would be a battery commander's version. They could actually get 7 people sitting in the back, as well as the driver up the front, who's sitting lower down in the front there, to the left of the person who's actually popping their head out the top. Has range finders in there as well to help with the ranging of the guns. As I mentioned, this one was, there's different variations depending on the hierarchy you are in the Soviet artillery. This particular one would be given to a battalion commander. They'd have slightly different radio sets and different arrangement depending on the hierarchy or where you were in the system.
The thing's powered by a V12 diesel, which is pretty well standard for most Soviet vehicles, in fact. and it gives it a reasonable turn of speed, but it's not terribly good on cornering, as you will have noticed. But it's still an interesting and impressive vehicle to see going round. You won't see many of them anywhere.
Now, the next bit of armour coming on, again, I hope you've got your pens and pencils ready, because this is another one of those stories. It looks like a Soviet tank, one of those classic Soviet tanks with the frying pan-shaped turrets from the Cold War. T-54 was the tank this is copied from. There was a Soviet tank, but this was actually a tank made by the Chinese. In the 1950s, the Russians gave T-54s to China. Don't forget, this is the era when China and Russia were great pals, and the Chinese copied it. And when it's a Chinese copy, it's called a Type 59. So it's a T-tank in Russian service and a Type tank that is in Chinese service. And this particular Type 59 is now slightly even more complex because it's got a British gun on it. It was actually bought by Royal Ordnance, and they put the L7 105mm gun we've seen earlier and we'll see again driving around the museum, in case countries that had bought the Type 59 would like to upgrade to the classic L7 gun. So it's one of these ones that was taken to trade fairs, touted around as if to say, would you like to come and have your type tanks upgraded to this standard? I don't think it sold particularly well, so after a certain amount of time, Royal Ordnance kindly gave the vehicle to the Tank Museum.
One thing you'll notice is typical of the Chinese vehicles, they seem to be a lot better made than their Russian equivalents. If you park that next to a T-54, although they look very similar, the finish on the Chinese tank is usually a heck of a lot better. Powered by a V12 engine, a V12 diesel in the back, and it's crosswise mounted at the back. Exactly the same really, except it's the licensable version as the T-54's original engine. But the only trouble with them was that the rounded type of turret, which as David said has always been likened to an inverted frying pan, gives you very limited ammunition storage. You have a driver in the front, a three-man crew in the turret, and it has torsion or Christie type suspension. There's a torsion bar on these things because the Christies were getting a bit long in the tooth by this time. It is an unusual tank to see. There aren't many Chinese tanks in the West at all yet, though one or two were captured in the Gulf. Got inside of the tank with a special armour modified on the Chinese one, and it's their Type 69. But this is a Type 59, and as David said, copied from the T-54. So it looks very similar, but you can tell when you get up close that you're looking at a well-made Chinese vehicle and not a rough-made Soviet one.
One issue we're always quite keen to try and make clear here at the Tank Museum, a lot of the stories of tanks are sometimes myths, sometimes they're national myths, sometimes they're done for very good propaganda reasons. And one of the stories we're always told is Western tanks were always so much better than the Eastern Bloc tanks, certainly through the Cold War. And on the whole, that's probably true to say, tank for tank. But the whole point about, if you're playing top trumps, you certainly would like a Western tank, one of the NATO tanks compared to one of these. But don't forget, it was how the tanks were going to be used. And the Soviet and probably the Chinese philosophy behind the tank, is very much in words of numbers. Get the numbers of tanks out there, and they're designed very much to support the type of warfare and how they wanted to fight wars rather than how we think they were going to be fought. And don't forget, when the Russians were going to advance, they would have huge numbers of tanks, and their attitude to the tanks was perhaps more our attitude to a hand grenade. If you need 5 hand grenades to clear a building, here's 5 hand grenades. If you need 5 T-54 tanks to get from A to B, here's 5 tanks, and there'll be another 5 ready to go from B to C. So it was sheer numbers designed to fight the NATO forces. And when we in the West, we looked at certain tank battles in the Middle East. We thought that those Russian-designed tanks didn't fight particularly well. The Russians weren't worried about that because they knew that was not how they intended to use those tanks if they had been used in anger properly in the Cold War in the way they wanted to use them. And as an example of this, we're now bringing on another Russian tank, a relatively new addition to the collection here, recently swapped with the Polish government. We swapped a Chieftain tank for this T-72, and this is a wonderful example of that Russian philosophy. Make a simple, well-built, reliable tank, and this one coming on now is the T-72.
At the moment, it's controlling the smoke stream by injecting diesel into the exhaust, which is something the Russians rather like doing. And that's why you get a large cloud of smoke from it. It's got torsion bar suspension, it's powered by the V12, and it's armed with a 125mm smooth bore gun. One of the problems with it was that in an effort to lower the profile, they did away with the loader, largely because the loader has to stand up in the turret. And by doing away with him, you could lower the profile of the tank completely, but it meant you had all the ammunition arranged in a rotary device like a carousel in the base of the turret. And this made the tank very vulnerable. The Allies who encountered them in the Gulf said they blew up like a firework when they were hit, and the turrets usually blew off. The Russians actually, at one point, tried to make a more advanced, technologically advanced tank anyway, which was their T-64. And no T-64s have been allowed out of Russia yet. The tank, originally, the T-64 at least, had a horizontally opposed diesel engine, based, some say, on sort of cheap design, but it took a long time to get that T-72 is far more practical. There is service everywhere, all over the world. You'll notice it's got side armour panels sticking out when it's going along. They're mainly facing forward, and they're there to protect the suspension to some extent from this sort of ammunition that could give you a premature explosion if you're not careful. But that's why it's carried.
T-72 has been made in many different variants, probably about 25,000 actually being used all around the world at the moment, so it's a very numerously produced tank. Very effective, very low profile. You look at that low profile, so again, a hard target to see and hit. And as with much of Soviet equipment, they did different variations depending on what country they were giving it to, or if they were being built in different countries. So the ones that the Soviet army were using actually had a higher standard of armour protection than some of those that were being built elsewhere. And one of the issues that, again, we follow at the Tank Museum, we've actually found one of these tanks in full working order with a live gun for sale for as low as €30,000. And in military terms, €30,000 for a tank is absolute peanuts. And the real worry now, of course, is those tanks, no one really knows where they all ended up. So it's one of those tanks, not only could we expect to meet, we will meet, or British forces will meet again in the future, because they're out there, they're in their large numbers, readily available, relatively cheap, and very, very reliable. They keep working with very little maintenance, which means